No doubt many of you are aware that Jurassic Park was adapted from the original novel by Michael Crichton. By adapting the original works, they could then turn it into a movie and show it to the general public. I mean, anyone could then go and see the film, but that wasn't always the case. The original material was far more graphic, darker, and would never be allowed to be shown to the audiences at the time. As such, these original scenes I'm talking about were adapted, altered, or completely cut out altogether to ensure that the film could be shown to general audiences. I mean, they even cut out numerous main characters' deaths. And that's exactly what this video is about today. We're going to be looking into the haunting abyss of Jurassic Park's original story. Some of it you may have heard, but I guarantee you there'll be something here you haven't. A prime example here is the T-Rex escape scene. Now, in the movie, we obviously see the T-Rex escape. It attacks the cars, attacks the children, attacks Ian Malcolm, eats the lawyer, but Alan Grant seems to bamboozle it with the vision. You know, the T-Rex can't see you if you don't move. Vision is based on movement. While something similar happens in the novel, Grant stops the T-Rex, appears to not be able to see Grant. But this couldn't be farther from the truth. You see, there's a dark and horrific undertone here. The T-Rex can indeed see him. And in fact, she can see Alan Grant perfectly. You see, Crichton completely retcons out Rex having amphibian frog DNA in the novelization of The Lost World. In fact, Rexy doesn't have any frog DNA in her at all. She wasn't hungry after eating the goat, and the motivation for the attack was to eject the vehicles from her territory. You know, we see exactly the same scene in The Lost World.
Mommy's very angry.
But then you might be asking, why doesn't she attack Grant? And this is where the dark tone comes in. You see, she can see Grant perfectly. She just wants Grant to run so she can pursue him, chase after him, and entertain herself. And here's an excellent audio representation of exactly what's going on with the T-Rex and sums it up perfectly. It's not very long and it's brilliantly done. Listen to this.
He was standing beside the passenger door of the Land Cruiser, drenched in rain. He was completely exposed. The Tyrannosaur no more than 8 feet away. The big animal roared again. At so close a range, the sound was terrifyingly loud. Grant felt himself shaking with cold and fright. He pressed his trembling hands against the metal of the door panel to steady them. The Tyrannosaur roared once more, but it did not attack. It cocked its head and looked with first one eye, then the other at the Land Cruiser, and it did nothing. It just stood there. What was going on? The big head slid past him, toward the rear of the car. Grant blinked. What had happened?
You see, she does exactly the same with Ian Malcolm. She chases Malcolm because it's fun for her. You see, she was confused at first why Grant wouldn't run from her. So she starts rowing, goes right up close. Grant doesn't run, and she's not bothered because she's still full from the goat. She had a sinister tendency and just wanted Grant to be afraid and chase him all along. Crichton even confirms this in the Lost World novel himself, where a villain, upon hearing about Grant's theory that the T-Rex cannot see very well, stops and stands still. The T-Rex promptly devours the man, and one of the characters then comment how Alan Grant was wrong about the movement-based vision. But here's something which was completely changed, and that's Henry Wu. You see, in the film's adaptation, Henry Wu survives, but in the novel's original story, Henry Wu suffers a terrible and horrific fate. You see, Dr. Wu, Ellie Sattler, and Robert Muldoon are in one of the park lodges. This is after all the dinosaurs have escaped, the power's gone out, and they went back to the safari lodge to recuperate, regroup, and think about a new plan. And at this point, there's a really dense fog. The raptors are also stalking them in this lodge, so they shut all the doors, although Ellie decides to leave. Henry Wu, realizing how intelligent these raptors are, goes after Ellie, opens the door, and shouts at her to come back inside. And at this point, he's jumped upon by a raptor from above. And the next part, well, I'll just read the extract for you. Muldoon didn't like that Wu was standing there with the door open, and he was about to say so when he saw a shadow descend from above. He realized at once what had happened. Wu was yanked bodily out the door, and Muldoon heard Ellie screaming. Muldoon got to the door and looked out and saw that Wu was lying on his back, his body already torn open by the big claw, and the raptor was jerking its head, tugging at Wu's intestines, even though Wu was still alive, still feebly reaching up with his hands to push the big head of the raptor away. He was being eaten whilst he was still alive. And then Ellie stopped screaming and started running alongside the fence. Muldoon slammed the door shut, dizzy with horror. It happened so fast. Ellie said, "It jumped down from above?" Muldoon nodded. He went to the window and looked out, and he saw that 3 raptors were outside the fence and were now running away, and that they weren't following Ellie, they were going back towards the visitor center. Now, it's understandable why they couldn't show that in the film. I mean, a dinosaur literally yanking Woo's intestines out while he's watching, still alive, feeling everything. That to me is far darker than anything we've had in any Jurassic movie. But we're not done there. You see, the fact that they killed off Dr. Wu wasn't the only change. They also changed John Hammond. You see, they adapted the novel for John Hammond to survive. He leaves Jurassic Park at the very end of the film, but in the novel it's completely different, and again a very, very dark fate for John. And I think to get the right mood and dark atmosphere, it's best read directly from the book, and I'm going to do that for you now. With his injured ankle, he couldn't climb the hill. He would have to wait at the bottom of the ravine. After the Tyrannosaurus had gone, he would call for help. Meanwhile, he was in no danger here. He felt his heart begin to race and felt an uneasy shortness of breath. He forced himself to relax. There was nothing wrong. Although he could not climb the hill, he could not be more than 100 yards from his own bungalow and the visitor center. Hammond sat down in the damp earth, listening to the sounds of the jungle around him, and then, after a while, he began to shout for help. Hammond thought he had heard footsteps on the path several times during the previous hour, and each time he had shouted for help, but somehow his voice hadn't carried far enough. He hadn't been rescued, and so, as the afternoon wore on, he began to realise that he would have to climb the hillside, injured leg or not. He's almost within sight of his bungalow, for God's sake. He was 76 years old. He was in no age to be climbing around hillsides. Personally, he expected to live up to be 100, but it was just a matter of taking care of yourself, he thought. He heard a squeaking, and then a chittering sound, some kind of small birds. Hopping in the undergrowth, he'd been hearing small animals all afternoon. There are all kinds of things here, rats, possums, snakes. The squeaking got louder, and small bits of earth rolled down the hillside past him. Something was coming, and then he saw a dark green animal hopping down the hill towards him, and another, and another. Compies, he thought with a chill. Scavengers. The compies didn't look dangerous. They were about as big as a chicken, and they moved up and down with little nervous jerks like chickens. But he knew they were poisonous. Their bites had a slow-acting poison that they used to kill crippled animals. Crippled animals, he thought, frowning. The first one of the compies perched on the hillside, staring at him. It stayed about 5 feet away beyond his reach. Others came down soon after, and they stood in a row, watching, while they hopped up and down, chittering and waving their little clawed hands. "Shoo! Get out!" he said, and threw a rock. The compies backed away, but only a foot or two. They weren't afraid. They seemed to know he couldn't hurt them. Angrily, Hammond tore a branch from a tree and swiped at them with it. They seemed to think he was playing a game. He thought again about the poison. He remembered that one of the animal handlers had been bitten by a compy in a cage. The handler had said the poison was like a narcotic. Peaceful, dreamy, no pain. He just wanted to go to sleep. The hell with that, he thought. Hammond picked up a rock, aimed carefully and threw it, striking one of the compies flat in the chest. The little animal shrieked in alarm as it was knocked backwards and rolled over its tail. The other animals immediately backed away. Hammond turned away and started to climb the hill once more, holding branches in both hands. He hopped on his left leg, feeling the ache in his thigh. He had not gone more than 10 feet when one of the compies jumped onto his back. He flung his arms wildly, knocking the animal away, but lost his balance and slid back down the hillside. As he came to a stop, a second compy sprang forward and took a tiny nip from his hand. He looked with horror. Seeing the blood flow over his fingers, he turned and began scrambling up the hillside again. Another compy jumped onto his shoulder, and he felt a brief pain as it bit the back of his neck. He shrieked and smacked the animal away. He turned to face the animals, breathing hard, and they stood all around him, watching him. From the bite on his neck, he felt warmth flow throughout his shoulders, down his spine. Lying on his back on the hillside, he began to feel strangely relaxed, detaching from himself, but he realized that nothing was wrong. No error had been made. Malcolm was quite incorrect in his analysis. Hammond lay very still as a child in its crib, and he felt wonderfully peaceful when the next compy came up and bit his ankle. He made only half-hearted effort to kick it away. The little animals edged closer. Soon they were chittering all around him like excited birds. He raised his head as another compy jumped onto his chest. The animal surprisingly light and delicate. Hammond felt only a slight pain, very slight, as the compy bent to chew his neck. To me, this is probably one of the most horrifying deaths of all. The fact that John Hammond knew he was initially in danger, got poisoned with a narcotic, and slowly slipped into a drug-like state where they ate him alive. To me, it's just extremely dark. But this next one may even top that, and it's to do with the baby raptor. You know, the raptor we see in the film where Dr. Alan Grant is there, they pick up the egg, John Hammond is there, they watch the baby raptor hatch. Now, have you ever thought to yourself, what actually happened to that raptor? Well, in the novel, it tells us that. But again, they adapted this so it wasn't shown in the movie. But I'm going to tell you about it now. When the cast visit the lab, they are just in time conveniently to watch this baby velociraptor hatch out of the egg, where John Hammond then tells us that he insists on being present at the birth of every dinosaur on the island. We then have this hugely touching scene where we see a baby dinosaur hatching out of the egg, nuzzling into the fingers. But then Alan Grant takes it into his hands and lets this cry, saying, "What species is this?" And Henry Wu tells us it's the velociraptor species. This completely shocks Dr. Alan Grant. Now, at this stage, this is the last point in which we see it on screen in the Jurassic Park movie. Sure, we see the fully grown velociraptors later on, but as for this baby velociraptor, that's the last moment of its screen time. But what is extremely interesting is the novel version basically follows exactly the same events as the film, deviates here and there, and guess what? They have the raptor in the novel version. The scene where it bursts out the egg like a chest burster is exactly the same as it is in the novel as it is in the film, although we see more of the raptor later on in the novel, and this is where we learn the actual fate of this dinosaur. In the novel, the raptor is far more cuddly and dependent on the humans. It nuzzles into Tim, it nuzzles into Alan, and basically follows them around. It does stay in the hatchery and pops up later on. Now brace yourselves, because this is slightly spoilery for the novel and does get a little bit sad and gruesome, so prepare yourselves. So in the novel, Dr. Alan Grant, Lex and Tim are being chased through the facility by velociraptors. They head into one of the labs where they're jumped upon by the baby velociraptor. It actually jumps on the back of Tim's leg or neck, I believe, and nuzzles into him. But at this point, they're still being chased by adult velociraptors. These velociraptors are basically now standing in front of Dr. Alan Grant, Lex, and Tim. The baby velociraptor, on the other hand, is now extremely hungry and scared and decides to nuzzle into Lex's neck, as if looking for shelter and comfort away from the other velociraptors. Dr. Alan Grant, Lex, and Tim assume that the velociraptors are looking for the baby, so they decide to basically throw the baby velociraptor at the other velociraptors as a distraction, or hoping that they're going to go away. This was a huge and the biggest mistake of the novel. The baby velociraptor slowly and cautiously walks up to the adult velociraptors as if it's looking at its parents, making little noises, and expects them to welcome it with open arms, or claws in this case. This isn't what happens, however. The velociraptors, upon seeing the baby, launch a flurried attack and rip this baby velociraptor in half and start to eat it. In a tragic twist of fate, this is what actually happened to our baby velociraptor. There's no way they could put that in the original film. I mean, watching a baby raptor be ripped to pieces by adult velociraptors. But one of the biggest changes from the novel to the film, I think, is Nedry's death. Now, I know, even in the film, it was quite horrific. I mean, he was blinded, eaten alive inside his Jeep, and left there to rot. But the novel's version is 10 times worse, believe me. You see, the same thing kinda happens. He does get spit in his eyes. The dinosaur had literally spit in his eyes. And I think, well, I'll read it from the book. It's only short, but it's very telling. Even as he realized it, the pain overwhelmed him, and he dropped to his knees, disorientated, wheezing. He collapsed onto his side, his cheek pressed against the wet ground, his breath coming in thin whistles through the constant, ever-screaming pain that caused flashing spots of light to appear behind his tightly shut eyelids. The earth then shook beneath him, and Nedry knew the dinosaur was moving. He could hear its soft hooting cry, and despite the pain, he forced his eyes open, and still he saw nothing but flashing spots against black. Slowly, the realization came to him. He was blind. The hooting was louder as Nedry scrambled to his feet and staggered back against the side panel of the car as a wave of nausea and dizziness swept over him. The dinosaur was close now. He could feel it coming close. He was dimly aware of its snorting breath, but he couldn't see. He couldn't see anything, and his terror was extreme. He stretched out his hands, waving them wildly in the air to ward off the attack he knew was coming. And then there was a new, soaring pain, like a fiery knife in his belly, and Nedry stumbled, reaching blindly down to touch the ragged edge of his shirt, and then a thick, slippery mass that was surprisingly warm. And with horror, he suddenly knew he was holding his own intestines in his hands. The dinosaur had torn him open. His guts had fallen out. Nedry fell to the ground and landed on something scaly and cold. It was the animal's foot. And then there was a new pain on both sides of his head. The pain grew worse, and as he was lifted to his feet, he knew the dinosaur had his head in its jaws, and the horror of the realization was followed by a final wish that it would all be ended very soon. Jurassic Park at its heart has always been horror. The original source material is horror and gore within a sinister, dark undertone. But all of this was lost to the abyss when they created the original movie. Sure, there was a horror element there, but they still wanted to keep it a family-friendly film. And it often leaves me wondering what we could have had if they followed this through with the pure horror of the novels. Would we have the franchise we have today, or would we have something totally different? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment sections below. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't covered every single death or every single change, and there are some horrible ones such as Ed Regis's death, Muldoon's survival, the raptor dens, but I've covered some of these in other videos, and not to mention what was kept in Paddock 10 of Jurassic World. All of this is on the channel, and I highly recommend checking it out. If you enjoyed this and some of the VHS tips being playing in the background, I highly recommend checking out the original creators, which are on screen now. They do a fantastic job, and I highly recommend checking out this series. They really embody and nail the original feel of the novel. Hell, some of them even created the scenes themselves. Great job, guys. With an extra special thanks to the members who are on screen now. These guys really do keep the power on in the park. With an extra special thanks to DVM Wannabe 1018 and Hammer Time, who are research executives in the park. And at this point, I'd like to point out Petersaurus Rex has been a member for 41 months, Deadshot Ends 15, and Celatay 42. Wow, thank you so much, guys. And a massive thanks to you to watching until the very end of this video. Thank you very much. And if you were in Jurassic Park and you came across a velociraptor, could your day get any worse? You bet Jurassic can. Catch you later.